I bought a shack to hide my past. Then the lonely widow next door made me want to live again. Daniel parked his old dusty truck on the narrow dirt road, the tires crunching against the gravel. He stepped out and stretched, feeling the chill of the early morning air brush against his face. The sky was a pale gray, the kind that promised rain but never delivered it quickly. He looked at the small shack ahead of him, barely visible through the overgrown weeds and wild grass. It wasn't much. Just 4 walls, a sagging roof, and a tiny porch that seemed more broken than inviting. But it was his. He had bought it on a whim, almost without thinking, in a moment when the world had become too heavy to bear. The past few years had been a storm he couldn't escape. Mistakes piled on mistakes, relationships frayed. Opportunities slipped through his fingers like sand. He had tried to fix some of it, to patch together a life that made sense, but every effort ended in disappointment. So now, here he was, far from the noise of the city, far from people who knew him and could judge him, far from the constant reminder of what he had lost. Daniel took a slow walk around the shack, pushing aside branches that had crept up against the walls. The wood was weathered, gray in most places, splintered in others. He knelt to examine the foundation and grimaced at the uneven stones beneath. "It'll do," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. There was work to be done. Repairs that would take weeks, maybe months. But he didn't mind. He liked the idea of spending days doing something simple, something tangible. It felt safer than facing the tangled mess of his life in the city. Inside, the shack smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly sweet, like old flowers. Daniel ran his fingers along the counters and shelves, imagining what it might look like with a fresh coat of paint, with sunlight streaming through the small windows. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't happiness, at least, not yet. But it was a moment of relief, a pause in the storm of thoughts that usually haunted him. He dropped his bag on the floor and sank into the old, threadbare chair by the fireplace. The room was empty except for a small wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a mattress in the corner. Simple, bare, and lonely. Daniel closed his eyes and let himself breathe, feeling the silence press in around him. It was quiet here. Too quiet, maybe, but he welcomed it. He had spent years surrounded by noise, constant chatter, the endless demands of work, the reminders of what he had lost. Here, he could finally hear himself think. Hours passed in slow, steady waves. He explored the property, walked down the narrow path that led to the edge of the small forest behind the shack, and even found an old stream that bubbled quietly over smooth stones. It was nothing grand, nothing majestic, but it felt like a small slice of peace. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him. No one would ask him why he had failed, why he had hurt others, why he had disappeared. Here, he could simply exist. That night, he lit a small lantern and cooked a simple meal over the tiny stove he had found under a dusty tarp. The food was basic, nothing like the elaborate dinners he used to make for friends and family. But it was warm, and the act of cooking gave him a strange comfort. As he ate, he thought about his life before this shack, about the city, the bustling streets, the people who had been important and then gone. The memories were sharp, like little pinpricks, but he forced himself not to dwell on them. He had come here to hide, not to reopen old wounds. The first few days were the hardest. Daniel woke up early, instinctively checking his phone, only to remember he had left it in the truck. No messages, no reminders, no notifications, just silence. It was unnerving at first. He realized how attached he had been to the constant presence of others, to the digital noise that never truly left him alone. But slowly he began to appreciate it. The silence was not empty. It was full of possibility. Full of space to think, to breathe, to begin again, even if he wasn't sure what again meant. At night, he would sit on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket he had brought from the city. The stars were brighter here, unfiltered by the glow of streetlights. He could see the outline of trees against the dark sky, hear the rustle of leaves in the wind, and smell the damp earth after a light rain. The world felt bigger, quieter, and somehow kinder than he remembered. Yet despite the beauty, there was a loneliness that settled deep in his chest. It was not the city's noise or people he missed. It was the warmth of connection, the simple comfort of someone caring. But he pushed the thought away. He wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Days turned into a week. Daniel spent his mornings chopping firewood and clearing the small yard around the shack. His muscles ached in ways that reminded him he was alive. In the afternoons, he would explore the surrounding land, walking along the forest edge, sometimes stopping to sit on a fallen log and watch the small animals that made their homes there. Rabbits, birds, squirrels, they seemed unconcerned with the past or the future, living in the moment in a way he had long forgotten how to do. Evenings became a time of reflection. He would light the lantern, sit by the small table, and write in a notebook he had brought from the city. Not letters, not plans, just thoughts. The words spilled out slowly at first, awkward and clumsy, but over time they became a kind of therapy. He wrote about mistakes, regrets, dreams, and fears, letting the ink carry the weight that had been sitting on his shoulders for years. It wasn't a cure, but it was a start. One rainy afternoon, Daniel heard movement outside. He froze, heart racing, but saw no one at first. Then he noticed a figure across the narrow road, a woman, older, moving slowly as she carried a basket of laundry. She disappeared behind her house, and Daniel realized she was a neighbor. He had seen other houses in the distance, but until now he had avoided thinking about the people who might live there. His instinct was to retreat, to hide further, but curiosity pricked at him. He wondered who she was, what her life looked like, and if she too carried scars from the past. For several days he avoided interaction, sticking to his routines, but he couldn't stop noticing her. Sometimes she would be in her garden, her hands busy in the soil, humming softly. Other times he would see her on the porch, reading a book or watching the wind move through the trees. She seemed quiet, gentle, and somehow unafraid of the silence he had embraced. Daniel found himself strangely drawn to the presence of another human being, even if he would never admit it. The isolation he had sought began to feel both comforting and empty. The shack was his sanctuary, yes, but the emptiness around it mirrored the emptiness inside him. He realized that no matter how far he ran from the past, he could not escape the part of himself that longed for connection, for kindness, for someone to care. And yet he pushed the thought aside, telling himself that solitude was safer, simpler, easier. By the end of the second week, Daniel began making small improvements to the shack. He fixed a broken step, cleaned out the small fireplace, and patched up a hole in the roof that had been letting in water. Each repair was a small victory, a reminder that he could still create something, even if it was only a simple home in the woods. He worked methodically, finding satisfaction in effort and patience. Still, every evening he would sit on the porch, blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the sky darken and stars emerge. He thought about the life he had left behind, the mistakes he could not undo, and the people he had lost. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt a quiet spark of possibility. The world was still harsh, still unforgiving, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to start over, even if it began with nothing more than a small shack, a notebook, and the steady rhythm of the wind in the trees. Daniel did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would ever feel at peace with himself, if the scars of the past would fade, or if he would find the connection he secretly longed for. But as he sat in the stillness of his new home, listening to the soft sounds of nature, he realized that hiding was no longer enough. Surviving was not the same as living. And somewhere deep inside, buried beneath regret and fear, a small, fragile hope began to take root. It was in that silence, that emptiness, and that quiet determination that Daniel first felt the possibility of something more, something that could slowly, painfully, but surely lead him back to life. Daniel had settled into a rhythm in his small shack, the quiet and simplicity providing a strange kind of comfort. Yet, as days passed, he began noticing small movements across the narrow dirt road. At first, it was only a shadow, someone moving behind the curtains of the house next door. Then he saw her more clearly, a woman, older, tending to a small garden. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat, her hands moving steadily in the soil, pulling weeds and planting tiny seeds. Daniel didn't know why he felt a sudden curiosity. He had spent weeks avoiding people, thinking the world was better left behind. He had built this life to hide, to protect himself from judgment and questions he could not answer. And yet, seeing her, watching her quiet routines, stirred something he hadn't felt in years. It was not longing exactly, but a strange sense of recognition, as if he remembered a life before his mistakes, before regret had wrapped itself around him like a heavy coat. For several days he tried to ignore her presence. He kept to his routines, chopping wood in the morning, cleaning the small shack in the afternoon, writing in his notebook in the evening. Yet, every time he stepped outside, he found himself glancing across the road. Sometimes she looked up, meeting his eyes briefly, then returning to her work. Daniel quickly looked away, embarrassed at his own curiosity. He was a man who had promised himself solitude, and yet, this woman, this stranger, was slowly claiming his attention. One morning, as Daniel carried water from the small stream behind his shack, he noticed her struggling with a large basket. Without thinking, he walked across the road and offered to help. "Do you need a hand?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She looked up at him surprised, then smiled. "Oh, thank you. That would be wonderful," she said, her voice soft and warm. Her name was Margaret, she explained, and she had lived in the house for many years, ever since her husband passed away. The basket was full of laundry she had hung to dry overnight. Together, they carried it inside her small home. Daniel, noticing how neat and cozy it was, the shelves lined with small mementos, photographs, and jars of homemade preserves. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself visiting Margaret more often. Sometimes it was for help with something simple, a broken fence post, a stubborn garden tool, a leaky tap, but often it was for no reason at all. He realized he enjoyed her company. She had a calmness that made him feel safe, a quiet joy in her small routines that reminded him there was life beyond his shack, life that was not only about survival, but also about connection.
Margaret, for her part, seemed to accept his presence without question.
She didn't pry into his past or ask about the city. She only offered small gestures of kindness, a slice of homemade bread, a cup of tea, a gentle question about how he was feeling. Daniel found himself opening up in small ways, talking about his days, the repairs he had done, the animals he had seen in the forest. He still avoided speaking of his past mistakes, but even these small conversations were a bridge, a thread connecting him to another human being. One afternoon, they worked together in her garden, planting new seeds in neat rows. The sun was warm, the soil cool and rich under their hands. Daniel felt a sense of peace he had not known for years. He realized he had forgotten the feeling of working alongside someone else, the simple satisfaction of shared effort. Margaret hummed softly as they worked, and the sound settled around him like a gentle melody. "Do you come here often?" she asked suddenly, looking at him with a small smile.
Daniel hesitated. "I
just moved here," he admitted.
"I wanted some time away."
"To think," Margaret nodded knowingly. "Sometimes we all need a place to think, a place to remember who we are." Her words were simple, but they resonated deeply with him. He realized he had spent so long running from himself that he had forgotten who he was or who he could be. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel began noticing small things about Margaret's life. She lived alone, yes, but her days were full of quiet purpose. She tended to her garden, baked bread, wrote letters to old friends, and cared for a few chickens that wandered freely around her yard. Daniel admired her resilience. Losing a partner could have left her bitter, lonely, or withdrawn, yet she remained warm, generous, and alive. There was a light about her that contrasted with the darkness he carried, and he found himself drawn to it, not fully understanding why. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Margaret invited him inside for tea. Her small living room smelled faintly of baked apples and herbs. She poured the tea carefully, placing a cup in front of him, and they sat quietly, listening to the wind rustle the leaves outside. Daniel wanted to speak, to say something meaningful, but words failed him. Instead, he simply sipped the tea, feeling the warmth spread through him. It was a simple moment, but it was enough. "Sometimes the quiet can feel heavy," Margaret said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "But it can also be gentle. It can remind us of what matters." Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. Her words lingered with him long after he returned to his shack. That night he sat on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark silhouettes of trees against the starlit sky. For the first time he realized that solitude was not the same as peace. He had thought that hiding in this shack would heal him, but now he understood that healing required more than silence. It required connection, trust, and the courage to let someone else into your life, even if only slowly, carefully, and cautiously. Over the next few days, Daniel began to look forward to seeing Margaret. He noticed the small details about her, the way her hands moved with purpose, the gentle tilt of her head when she smiled, the sound of her voice humming quietly as she worked. He found himself wanting to help her, not out of obligation, but because it felt good to be needed, to share a small part of life with someone else. One rainy morning, he saw her struggling with a broken wheelbarrow. Without hesitation, he grabbed his tools and ran across the road. Together, they repaired it, tightening bolts, replacing a handle, and testing it with a basket of soil. Margaret laughed when it worked perfectly, a sound so genuine that Daniel felt a warmth in his chest he had not felt in years. "You're very handy," she said, smiling at him. Daniel shrugged, embarrassed. "I've done my share of repairs in the past," he said quietly. "Good work is always worth doing," Margaret replied simply. Her words struck him. It was not praise he had ever received, often not the kind that made him feel recognized, appreciated. He realized he had spent so long hiding, thinking he had nothing to offer the world, that he had forgotten he could still contribute, still care, still matter. Evenings became easier now. Instead of sitting alone in silence, he found himself sharing small stories with Margaret, recounting small adventures in the woods, minor mishaps with repairs, and little joys he had discovered in this new life. She listened attentively, occasionally asking gentle questions, encouraging him to notice the beauty in small moments. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but Daniel began to feel something he had not felt in a long time: hope. He realized that Margaret, without even trying, was drawing him out of his shell. Her quiet presence, her patience, and her unwavering kindness were showing him that life could still be meaningful, that joy could exist even after disappointment and loss. One afternoon, while they were planting flowers along the edge of her garden, Margaret paused and looked at him. "You've changed," she said softly. Daniel looked at her startled. "Changed? Yes," she replied. "There's a light in your eyes now, a small one, but it's there. You're starting to live again." He wanted to argue, to tell her that he was still broken, still hiding, still running from the past, but deep down he knew she was right. He had started to live again, in small ways, by noticing beauty, by offering help, by sharing moments of quiet connection. From that day on, their bond grew steadily. Daniel no longer felt the same crushing weight of isolation. The world had not yet forgiven him, nor had he forgiven himself completely, but he was beginning to understand that life was not meant to be endured alone. Margaret, without ever asking for anything, had reminded him of the simplest, most essential truth. To live fully, one must allow themselves to care and be cared for. And as the days stretched into weeks, Daniel began to feel a sense of belonging he had thought he would never experience again. He had come to the shack to hide from his past, to escape his mistakes, but he had found something far more profound, a connection that reminded him that life, even after loss and regret, could be gentle, meaningful, and alive. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's life, once defined by isolation and silence, began to shift in ways he had never anticipated. He still rose early, chopped firewood, cleaned the shack, and wandered the forest, but now his days often included a visit to Margaret. Sometimes it was for help with chores, other times just to sit together in her cozy kitchen and drink tea. Little by little, Daniel found himself sharing more than he ever thought possible. Not the deepest secrets, not yet, but small truths. The way he missed the city sometimes, the discomfort he felt living so close to others again, the awkwardness of trying to belong somewhere. Margaret, as always, listened without judgment. She would nod gently, hum softly, or ask a quiet question that invited him to explore his thoughts. "Tell me more about that," she would say, or "How does that make you feel?" She had a way of speaking that made it safe to speak, as though nothing he said would ever be wrong. Daniel began to notice how rare that feeling was in his life. The kind of trust that didn't demand perfection. The kind of acceptance that didn't require an explanation. One afternoon, after a morning spent repairing a broken gate, Margaret invited Daniel to sit in her garden. The sun was soft, filtering through the branches of an old oak tree, casting dappled light on the small flowers that lined her garden path. Margaret handed him a cup of tea and gestured to a wooden bench.
Sit with me a while, she said. Sometimes talking helps, and sometimes just sitting is enough.
Daniel hesitated for a moment, then sat down. He felt the warmth of the tea in his hands, felt the wind gently moving through the leaves, and noticed for the first time in a long while that he was calm. The shack and the forest were comforting, yes, but being near another person, someone who cared, even in small ways, was different. It stirred something in him that he couldn't quite name. He looked at Margaret, her face lined with years of experience, her eyes gentle and patient. For a long time he said nothing, listening instead to the faint sounds of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the distant trickle of a stream. Finally he spoke, his voice low and hesitant.
I wasn't always like this, he began, almost apologetically. I made mistakes. I hurt people. I lost my way.
Margaret nodded, taking a slow sip of her tea. We all do, she said softly.
Mistakes are part of being human. It's what we do after that matters.
Daniel wanted to tell her everything. The failed relationships, the job he lost, the friends he disappointed, the family he had pushed away. But the words caught in his throat. Fear had always been stronger than courage. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of facing the truth of himself. Yet Margaret's presence was different. There was no pressure, no expectation. She was simply there, patient and steady, waiting for him to decide when and how to speak. Over the next few days, Daniel began to open up in small ways. He told Margaret about his childhood, the dreams he once had, the mistakes he had made in his 20s and 30s. He told her about the moments he had wished he could undo, the relationships that had ended badly, and the sense of failure that had driven him to leave everything behind.
Margaret never interrupted.
She did not judge. She simply listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes smiling, sometimes offering a quiet word of encouragement. One rainy evening, Daniel found himself sitting in his shack, staring at the fire he had built in the small fireplace. Margaret had stopped by earlier, bringing a basket of fresh bread and a pot of soup. They had shared a simple meal together, and then she had left, smiling gently as she waved goodbye. Daniel thought about the conversation they had had, about the life he had left behind, and about the man he had become. For the first time, he realized that hiding from his past had not made him free. It had only kept him from living fully. The next morning, Daniel decided to take a small step. He walked to Margaret's house, carrying a box of tools he had used to repair the shack. I thought maybe I could help you with something, he said, holding it out. Margaret looked surprised but pleased.
That would be wonderful, she said. There's always something to fix around here.
Together they spent the morning repairing a broken garden fence. As they worked, Daniel found himself talking more freely, sharing small details about his past that he had never voiced aloud. Margaret listened, asked gentle questions, and offered quiet reassurance. By the time the fence was repaired, Daniel felt lighter. It was as if sharing the burden even in small pieces had made it more bearable. In the days that followed, Daniel began to notice changes in himself. He no longer avoided the mirror, no longer flinched at his own reflection. He began to laugh more easily, even if it was quiet and hesitant at first. He started noticing beauty in the world around him, the way sunlight glinted on the leaves, the sound of birds singing in the morning, the simple pleasure of a warm meal. And always, Margaret was there, a steady presence that encouraged him to keep moving forward. One afternoon, while they were planting new flowers in her garden, Margaret paused and looked at him with a serious expression. Daniel, she said, I can see that you're holding something back. I don't want to push, but I want you to know that you can tell me anything. I'm here to listen. Daniel hesitated, feeling the weight of years of fear and regret pressing down on him. But then he realized something important. He was tired of hiding. tired of running from himself. He took a deep breath and began to speak, slowly at first, then with more confidence. He told her about the decisions that had led him here, the failures that had haunted him, and the loneliness that had driven him to seek isolation. Margaret listened quietly, her eyes full of understanding. When he finished, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," she said gently. "But you don't have to anymore.
You can start again, one step at a time."
Those words struck Daniel deeply. He realized that he had been punishing himself for too long, holding on to guilt that served no purpose except to keep him trapped. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different future. Not one free from mistakes, but one where he could live, love, and connect again. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Margaret continued to grow closer. They spent long afternoons working in the garden, fixing the shack and exploring the nearby forest. They shared meals, stories, and quiet moments of reflection. Daniel began to feel a sense of peace he had not known in years. He still carried the weight of his past, but it no longer defined him. The world had not forgotten him, but he had begun to forgive himself. One evening, as the sun set over the forest, Daniel and Margaret sat on the porch of her house, sipping tea and watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. Daniel realized that he was smiling genuinely and freely for the first time in a long while.
Margaret glanced at him and smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You're different," she said softly.
Daniel nodded.
"I feel different," he admitted. "I think
I'm starting to live again." Margaret reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture of connection that spoke volumes. Daniel felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of belonging he had thought was lost forever. He realized that life, even after mistakes and loss, could still offer moments of joy, connection, and hope. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel continued to confront his past with Margaret's support. He wrote letters he never intended to send, shared stories he had long kept hidden, and reflected on the man he wanted to become. Margaret's presence gave him the courage to face his regrets and embrace the possibility of a new beginning. Through their shared moments, Daniel learned an essential truth. Healing was not about erasing the past, but about acknowledging it, learning from it, and choosing to move forward. Margaret had not judged him, had not demanded change, but had simply offered kindness, patience, and understanding. In doing so, she had opened a door Daniel thought had been closed forever. By the end of this chapter of his life, Daniel understood that solitude could no longer be his only refuge. The shack had provided safety, but Margaret had shown him that connection, trust, and care were just as important for healing. He had begun to confront his past, not with fear or shame, but with a sense of possibility and hope. And in doing so, he had discovered that life, even after loss and regret, could still be full of light, warmth, and meaning. Days had become brighter for Daniel, not because the sun shone any more than before, but because he finally felt it within himself. The shack that had once been a refuge from the world was now a place of quiet comfort, a home in which he could slowly rebuild his life. Margaret continued to be a steady presence next door, her gentle patience and quiet encouragement slowly helping him heal in ways he hadn't thought possible. Every morning, Daniel woke early, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. He chopped firewood with purpose, tended to his small garden, and repaired parts of the shack that had been neglected. He discovered satisfaction in the simplicity of daily work. Even small accomplishments, a fixed step, a mended fence, a freshly tilled patch of soil, brought a sense of pride he had not felt in years. And always there was Margaret sharing quiet smiles, offering guidance, or simply watching the world with him, her presence a comforting reminder that life could still be gentle. One morning, after a long night of rain, Daniel stepped outside to find Margaret already in her garden. The earth was dark and rich, dotted with puddles that reflected the gray morning sky. She looked up and waved, her wide-brimmed hat still dusted with drops of rain. "Good morning," she called. "The rain has left everything so fresh today." Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "It does," he agreed. "It almost makes me forget how messy the world can be." Margaret laughed softly, a gentle sound that reminded him how long it had been since he had truly heard joy. "Sometimes it's the little things that matter most," she said. The weeks that followed were filled with small, meaningful moments. Daniel began helping Margaret more regularly, watering her plants, repairing old fences, carrying groceries, and in return she taught him about gardening, cooking simple meals, and appreciating the quiet rhythms of life. He found himself enjoying these moments more than he had expected. There was a deep satisfaction in helping someone, in being needed, and in sharing in the simple pleasures of daily life. But Daniel's journey of healing was not without its challenges. Old memories and regrets sometimes resurfaced unexpectedly, reminding him of the mistakes that had led him to seek isolation. There were moments when he felt the weight of guilt and failure pressing down, threatening to pull him back into despair. Yet Margaret's presence provided a steady anchor. She never judged, never scolded, but simply offered a listening ear, a quiet word of encouragement, or a reassuring smile. One afternoon, while they were working together to repair a section of the old barn on Margaret's property, Daniel paused and looked out at the forest beyond. "Do you ever regret things?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. Margaret looked at him, her hands resting on the hammer she held. "We all do," she said. "But regret is only useful if it teaches us something. Otherwise, it just holds us back." Daniel nodded, letting her words sink in. He realized she was right. For years he had carried regret as a chain, binding him to a past that could not be changed. Now, he began to see that he could use those experiences to guide him, to help him make better choices, and to appreciate the life he still had. As spring turned into early summer, Daniel noticed changes not just in himself, but in the world around him. The forest seemed greener, the flowers more vibrant, the air filled with the cheerful songs of birds. He felt alive in a way he hadn't for years. Even the small chores he once viewed as tedious became opportunities for connection and mindfulness. Carrying water, planting seeds, mending fences, each act was a reminder that life, even in its simplest form, was worth living. Margaret, too, seemed to flourish with Daniel's presence. She smiled more often, laughed more freely, and sometimes looked at him with a warmth that went beyond friendship. Daniel realized that he was no longer the same man who had arrived at the shack, weighed down by guilt and regret. He was beginning to embrace life fully, not just as a way to hide, but as a way to heal and grow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel and Margaret sat together on her porch. They shared a simple meal, fresh bread, homemade soup, and a small dessert Margaret had baked. They talked quietly about their days, the repairs they had made, and the small discoveries in the forest. Daniel felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling that had been foreign to him for many years. "You've come a long way," Margaret said softly, her eyes reflecting the fading light. Daniel looked at her, feeling a mix of gratitude and awe. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "I thought I wanted to hide forever, but you've shown me that life can still be beautiful." Margaret reached out and placed a hand on his.
"You've always had the strength," she said. "You just needed someone to remind you of it."
The warmth of her touch, the sincerity of her words, and the beauty of the moment settled in Daniel's heart. He realized that life was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace. The shack that had once been a place of hiding had become a place of rebirth, a place where he could rebuild not only his home but his spirit. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to explore more of the surrounding area. He walked the forest trails, discovered hidden streams, and even began sketching the landscapes he encountered. He found joy in capturing the beauty around him, in noticing details he had once overlooked. The curve of a tree branch, the ripple of water over stones, the delicate pattern of wildflowers. Margaret often joined him on these walks, sharing stories of her own past and the lessons she had learned from a life filled with love, loss, and resilience. Daniel also began to reach out to the community. He attended small gatherings in the nearby village, offering help where he could and slowly reconnecting with the world he had once abandoned. Each interaction, though brief, reminded him that connection and kindness existed everywhere and that life was richer when shared with others. One morning, Daniel woke early and noticed Margaret tending to her garden with unusual determination. "What are you doing?" he asked, curious.
I thought I'd plant some new flowers, she replied. Life is too short to wait for perfect moments.
We must create them ourselves, Daniel smiled, realizing how much he had absorbed her wisdom. He spent the morning helping her, digging, planting, and watering together. By the end of the day, their garden was vibrant with color, a symbol of the growth they had nurtured in themselves and each other. As summer deepened, Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude. He was no longer running from the past, nor was he trapped by it. He had found peace in the simplicity of his daily life, joy in small accomplishments, and a deep connection with Margaret. She had shown him that healing was not about forgetting mistakes, but about accepting them and choosing to move forward with courage and hope.
One evening, as they watched the sun set together, Daniel reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the man who had arrived at the shack, lonely, broken, and unsure of his future.
He realized that man still existed, but he had been transformed by patience, kindness, and the gentle guidance of someone who cared. Margaret had been that guiding light, helping him rediscover the beauty of life and the strength within himself.
You know,
Margaret said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence,
I'm proud of you.
Thank you, he whispered, for everything. Margaret smiled, her hand brushing lightly against his.
Life is better when we share it, she said simply. And in that moment, Daniel understood. Life was not about hiding from mistakes or running from pain. It was about embracing each day, cherishing connection, and finding joy in simple moments.
The shack that had once been a refuge from the world had become a sanctuary of renewal. Margaret's presence had shown him that it was never too late to start again, to love, to care, and to live fully. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, casting the world in shades of twilight, Daniel felt a sense of completion and anticipation all at once. He knew the future would bring challenges, as it always did, but he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had found a friend, a guide, and perhaps something more in Margaret, a presence that reminded him daily that life, even after mistakes and sorrow, could still be rich, warm, and meaningful.
The shack, once a place to hide from the past, had become a place to embrace the present and hope for the future.
Daniel had learned that life's greatest gifts often came from unexpected sources. The quiet kindness of a neighbor, the gentle encouragement of someone who believes in you, and the courage to face your own heart. In the stillness of that evening, with Margaret beside him and the world around them alive with the sounds of nature, Daniel realized that he was finally living, not just surviving, not just hiding, but truly living again.
And in that living he found a joy and peace that he had thought were lost forever.